ahead and get rolling. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to come down, spend a little bit of time together. I had originally put some of this together for a community group about a year ago, somewhere in that time frame. And so we wanted the opportunity. I know we have a lot of new folks, and we also have a lot of folks that maybe haven't seen some of the pieces and parts of this. So we thought it might be kind of fun to get everyone together and talk a little bit about the history. One of the things that we all know with history is that it has many different roads, no matter what part of history you're looking at. And so one of the things that I tried to do is, in looking at that history, as you go down every bend you take, you find a new road to travel. And then after you go down that road, you find a new rabbit trail to run down. So I really had to try to kind of look at the wave tops, and I wanted to look at the origin story of Evergreen Washelli. So we're gonna go back to the early days and come up through, and there's a lot of areas that I would love to delve down, but I've kind of kept myself somewhat between the rails because anything with history tends to take me down more rabbit trails than I know what to do with. So, and then keep in mind, because it is March, and you should recognize that oftentimes we as the Irish don't necessarily let the facts get in the way of a good story. So you can fact check me on many of these things, and they may or may not be 100% accurate, but I tried to keep it as accurate as we could as we went along. So in order to talk about Evergreen Washelli, let's take a few minutes and we're going to give ourselves the permission to drift back over time. Give your imagination the permission to drift back over time. And I also, for a minute, want you to drift back and put yourself at 19 years old, because that's where we're going to begin. And at 19 years old, David Denny, his brother Arthur, and several of their family members came across from Illinois, and they were down in the Portland area. One of their goals was to find a new place to form a new community, and Portland wasn't quite it. They wanted to explore north, and they came up into the Puget Sound. And on that original party, there were the three individuals that came north to explore, and that's when they started to see what they saw before them, which would be an amazing place to build a community and to thrive. So at that time, what they did was David decided he was going to stay back and he was going to remain there. The others were going to go retrieve the rest of the party. David's task, or his job, was to kind of help get the shelter taken care of. Keep in mind, when they arrived, there is nothing. There's no infrastructure, there's no shelter, there's no food. They are complete pioneers at that point in time. One of the things that happened was David had hit himself in the leg with an axe, and so he was not well, not feeling good. It was in October, November timeframe, so he was in the cold and the rain, and he is 100% all alone. And he had sent a message with one of the fellows who was going back to the Portland area that basically said, we've examined the valley of the Duwamish and find it a fine country. There is plenty of room for 1,000 settlers. Come at once. And that was to his brother Arthur. They would come to build a community. So when the party came, the full party was made up of 10 adults and about 12 children. And as they arrived, they came on a little schooner called the Exact. And they first arrived out at Alki Point. One of the gentlemen called it New York at that time, and New York Alki. They had actually spent the first season there, the first winter there, and then decided that they would jump over to Elliott Bay because they discovered that was a much better place to create that community for boat travel, all of those types of things. And on that trip, or when they came in, to tell you a little bit about one of the individuals that will resurface in this story is Louisa Boring. You'll hear that name again. And Louisa and some of her family were also part of that trip that came out. Well, a couple of things that happened is, at that time, Seattle starts to grow over a couple of years, And with that, you have all the things that you would have in a pioneer town. Rough and tumble, a little rough around the edges. You would have new births and you would have deaths. And so one of the things that came into light is, what do we do with those deaths? We need to talk about cemeteries, and that's a part of our origin story. And what we know is that there were likely there were a few different things. On some of the bluffs, they found some burial sites that were there. Mostly that was the native folks that were there that were burying. And then when we look at that history, there's a couple of other spots that there were burials, but it's a little bit gooey when you look over that history. And part of that was there was two areas that were known, and one of those was called, we call it today the Denny Hotel Cemetery. It was never called that. It never actually had a name, but as you see in the photo here, that was the Denny Hotel. Denny Hotel was placed on that area where for several years there were burials that took place. And so, and we'll get to that, but those bodies were eventually removed from there, but that's why it's referred to as the Denny Hotel Cemetery, even though that was never the official name. And then there was another spot, and that was called the White Church. That was the original church in Seattle. And it was identified also as the first formal burial grounds, and much like a lot of churches, off to the back side of that was a little burial ground that they formed. And that was a Methodist reverend and his wife that created that church. And one of the reasons I think that they called that name was simply the architecture and the color of it. That's a picture of the Little White Church at that time. Also, in one of the historical directories is that they identified that the Denny Church or the Denny Hotel, that was actually identified in the Seattle directory back in 1878 as indicating that there were about 20 burials that existed there. So let's jump over into David and Louisa Denny. Talk a little bit more about their family. So David and Louisa also happened to have been the first marriage in Seattle. They had met on the trip over and then through Portland and coming up, and they were one of the first couples that were married here in the Seattle area. That was in January of 1853. The wedding took place in his brother's cabin, little cabin, that was owned by Arthur and his wife. Louisa would later be known as the Sweet Briar Bride, and I'd love to run down that rabbit trail, but that's a story for a different day. But you will hear that term, and you'll still hear about it as it relates to the Denny's that are across the street now. As an aside, David Maynard, who was the territory's first justice of the peace, joined David and Louisa in the first wedding. And I found this little article that was kind of cute, I thought, in a way. They said that it kept things all in the family, or families. David's widowed father had already married Louisa's widowed mother, and his older brother had married Louisa's older sister. So the family was growing. David and Louisa would have 8 children of their own. 7 of those would grow into adulthood. And in 1867, there were a set of twins that were born. Baby Jonathan had only lived a couple of hours, and Jonathan had died. And at that time, they had to decide, what do we do now? So they went to the Little White Church, and baby Jonathan, who will resurface in our story a couple of times, was buried at the Little White Church Cemetery at that point in time. So Seattle's growing, population is growing, lots of things are happening. The city leaders understood that there was a need for a real cemetery because Seattle started to grow rather quickly in its early days. So they decided to have the first Seattle Municipal Cemetery. David and Louisa owned quite a bit of property, and one of the pieces of property that they had, they kind of wanted it for a park, but they conceded to the idea that we really do need a cemetery, and he donated those 5 acres to the city of Seattle. It wasn't the city of Seattle at that time, but to the founders, that they would use that for the cemetery itself, which would become the Seattle City Cemetery. This was the area of downtown roughly in that same time frame, just to give you a perspective of what that looked like. In Seattle itself, the plat itself was in, I believe, 1853, the first Seattle plat. It wasn't a city yet, but that's when it was developed and identified as Seattle, named after the chief that had helped so many of the settlers out, Chief Seattle. That's where that name came from. And it wasn't until 1869 that it was officially incorporated as a city. So with that, and with the idea of building a cemetery, a couple of things happened over the next several years, and it all made sense. Ordinance 15 was regulating burial within the city. Interestingly enough, that ordinance, the text of that, was lost to the Seattle fire. So that's all we know, is that that's what it identified. Later came the ordinance in number 36, which was the actual dedication, or the city of Seattle dedication of the cemetery, and also with that they identified the sexton of the cemetery. Sexton is a Latin term meaning sacristan, which is a protector or oversees important objects. That's where that term comes from. So you'll still hear that term sexton today. Interestingly enough, in the early days of the statute, or of cemeteries, and even today in statute, sexton, that term is still used, and it's used in there in the sense that a sexton officially has police powers. Don't get me started with what we do that way today, but it's still in statute if you look at it. So with that in mind, then the next thing that happened was that they created the original birth and death certificates. So that was an ordinance in Seattle in 1883, and it's when they first determined that the deaths would be recorded in a registry, and that if there was going to be a burial or a disinterment, those would need to be permitted and filed with the city, which of course carries through to today as well. So all things are going great, right? We got a cemetery, things are functioning, everything's going along, it's all good. And then in 1884, the proposition before the city council said, we are going to abandon Seattle Cemetery. That ordinance, in July of 1884, converted Seattle Cemetery to a public park. They only had one little tiny problem. We had 223 burials at least that were in the cemetery. So what they did, which was brilliant, they formed a commission, and the Seattle Cemetery Commission, their responsibility was the oversight of what would happen with that, because they knew that they would have to remove all of those remains. So what they did is that they reached out and they decided that somebody needed to do all that work for them. And so when that commission was formed, they then looked to the first undertaker in Seattle, who was Oliver C. Shorey. And Shorey's job was going to be kind of huge when you think about it, because many of those burials, they were going to have to try to identify those, and they were going to have to reach out to family. Many of those burials, there would be no family because they were pioneers. So their responsibility was to make new cedar boxes for every single remains. They were going to dig all of the remains. They're going to transport those remains to the cemetery of the individual's choice or the family's choice. And they were also going to have to move all of the monuments and or any stonework that was there. So it was a bit of a daunting task when you really think about it. And at the time, they had done that. They had awarded him $3,000, which raised quite a little flurry, because they thought, wow, that's a lot. And afterwards, they looked and said he did an amazing job, and they did it in a rather expeditious manner. He had come, so Shorey had come, he was, as it was very common in that day, he was a woodworker, and he opened up a cabinet shop. Another gentleman by the name of DeLynn opened that with him, and then he threw out the Undertaker shingle in 1881, so he was really one of the very first that was here. When they moved those bodies, just so you know, a lot of the bodies went to, back then, the first Catholic cemetery was Holy Cross, and it's now, I believe, where the preparatory school is at. That's about the general location. Some went to the Masonic Cemetery, which you'll know as Lakeview Cemetery, so many of the bodies went there. And then some would go to the designated new cemetery, the second cemetery for Seattle, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So the bodies went to very different, a variety of different cemeteries as they all moved those out. And a little piece of trivia. So Shorey, at one point, sold his holdings to a gentleman by the name of Bonnie. And then DeLynn had sold his holdings to a gentleman by the name of Stewart. So then became Bonnie Stewart. Stewart ended up selling his holdings to a gentleman by the name of Watson. And therein comes Bonnie Watson. So that's where the origin of Bonnie Watson came from, through several different name changes and ownerships, and they've been around obviously for many, many years. So we've got a new cemetery. We've got to find a new cemetery. So where do we do that? Well, it just happened to be that in 1886, for about $2,000, the city had purchased about 40 acres of ground that happened to sit up on top of Capitol Hill. And that ground was being unused. The reason it was being unused is because they had designated that, and they had great high hopes. This is the perfect spot. We love it. It's beautiful. It's got a view. This is going to be awesome for the new state capitol. Well, Olympia had a little something to say about that. Seattle did not win, or was not awarded the state capitol, but that property that sat there, that's what they were hoping to use that for. So with that thought in mind, they said, let's take a little piece of that and let's make that the new Seattle cemetery, the new cemetery that we're going to have to move bodies to, and that's going to bring us into the future, right? Great. So that worked out wonderful. So a couple of things had to happen is that they said, well, should we call it Seattle Cemetery? No, it's going to be confusing. Now, the old one is Seattle Cemetery, and people are going to get confused, and it's in a different spot, and so what do we do? So they formed a commission, and with that commission, they said, okay, you assign the name, and this was in the same commission that had done the work for moving all the bodies. They said, let's go ahead and get a name. Let's start with that. So they threw out, and people put in different names. I think some of the names that were proffered were Interlake, Forest Hill, Cedar Grove, Fir Hill, Richwood, and Evergreen. So the wife of the mayor at that time had a friend by the name of Gilchrist Swan. Gilchrist Swan was known as a bit of a writer and was also known to be very knowledgeable about the Pacific Northwest as far as the indigenous people. So she reached out to him and said, give me your thoughts, what are your ideas? And he reached back out and talked with her, but in his diary, he had said that, I want to get that right, he said, yeah, so he wrote, I suggested Washelli, the Makah word for west wind, and then he quoted from Hiawatha to show that west is the region of the hereafter. Therefore, Washelli Cemetery would be the cemetery of the land of the hereafter. They looked at all the names, they landed on Washelli. So that second municipal cemetery would be the first Washelli Cemetery, and that's where that name came from. So that, they were able to accomplish that. And then, 1887. Again, things are going good, right? We've got our rules, our regs, we've got death certificates, we are doing awesome. And just 3 years later, Ordinance 877 said, that they were going to abandon that cemetery. So you can imagine, dude, it's 3 years later, they moved all of those bodies, they had done all of that. This is the cemetery that takes us into the future, and they are going to abandon all of that because they wanted it to be a park. Again, another city park. So at first, it was named Lakeview Park. Then they decided City Park was better. And then finally, they landed on eventually that they would name it after the volunteers from the Spanish-American War, and they would call that Volunteer Park. So today, you would recognize some of those images as Volunteer Park. Okay, so now I've taken you on a little diatribe, right? I want to take us back a couple years, and I want to jump back to 1884. So come with me for that for just a minute. (1884), that is when both Louisa and David had a decision to make. Because remember, baby Jonathan now had been moved from White Church to the New Seattle Cemetery, and now that was going to close, so they had to decide, where do we go from here now? So at that time, they thought about it, and in a little earlier, 1883, they had built a small cabin out way north of the city by Lipton Springs. They had owned some property out there. So they made the determination that baby Jonathan would go far north out of the city. They would never have to move him again. And he would go to Oak Lake. Oak Lake was the area that was known, that was right adjacent to their property. So here's a little bit of an interesting kind of aside, if you will. At the time that they did this, when they buried baby Jonathan, they didn't actually own that property. The U.S. government did. So what was going on was they had some friends by the name of Lindsley. If you saw the very first picture, if you read that, it would have Lindsley's name on there. But Lindsley was waiting to receive the grant. He was being granted all of that property from the U.S. government. And within days after he was granted, he turned around and sold that property over to David Denny. That is Oak Lake and part of our cemetery. It wouldn't be until 1891 that David would eventually file the plat for Oak Lake Cemetery for 40 acres. So it took some time. They were making burials during that time frame though, as time went along. And as you can see from the photos, it was 1886, just a couple years later, that the first Oak Lake School went into place. And then a historic picture from Oak Lake Cemetery there. David ended up dying just a few years later after he had filed the plat. He died in 1903. They had filed in 1901. This is just kind of fun because I'm not sure if he was joking a little bit or jabbing a little bit, but when he wrote this, this is part of the original document. The object of the undersigned in laying out this tract of land as a cemetery is to furnish a burial place for those who need the same, irrespective of nationality, color, or previous condition of servitude, where the rich and the poor will be on an equality, where the tax gatherer and the book agent will not ply their vocation, and where interest at 10% per annum is not reckoned up and added to the principal every 30 days. David T. Denny. On May 15th at 15 minutes past 10 o'clock. So I'm not sure if they had taxation go, I don't know what caused it, but that was what he chose to put on the articles when he filed that. And it would just be shortly thereafter that what would happen would his son, who is Victor Winfield Scott Denny, the youngest son of the Dennys, he would take over the deed for the property for Oak Lake Cemetery. And Victor would run that cemetery for a while. And so an interesting twist there is that he's running the cemetery. We don't know a lot about it, but up until about 1914, And then what's really interesting is he sold the property to a gentleman by the name of Silas Clark. Really don't know much about Silas Clark, but he sold the property, but then almost immediately the property was transferred over to the American Necropolis Company. American Necropolis was a company that had several cemeteries across the US at that point, and they acquired this from Denny. They were based out of St. Louis, Missouri, and on the paperwork when they filed, Silas Clark was also listed as the superintendent of the cemetery. Now, because it's a rabbit trail, I couldn't help myself from going. I shared this with Aaron earlier, thinking, superintendent, what kind of shenanigans are going on that we make the move to sell it to Silas? They immediately transferred. Something's going on there, but I have no clue what. So I thought I would find out a little something about Silas and see if I could nail that down. I didn't, but here's what I did find. In the newspaper at that time, leaving a terse note directing disposal of his body, Silas M. Clark, 67, former employee in Seattle brokerages houses, ended his life by gas in a rooming house at 224 8th Avenue. The note was added to his son, P.B. Clark, an inspector in the city building department. Clark had sealed the door and the windows with strips of torn clothing. He had rented the room last Thursday. So the auspicious craziness of Silas Clark, and they found him in a housing room that he had rented, and don't know what happened there. But I thought it was kind of interesting anyway. So let's talk about an American Necropolis Society, or association, or company. You'll hear both of those terms. They were a really interesting company. One of the great things that they did, and I think it was brilliant on their part, is they were the ones that restored the name Washelli to the cemetery. So Washelli would come back into the name. Oak Lake would remain a section within the cemetery, but it would now be known as Washelli. And it's so interesting that they landed on that, and they saw the wisdom of the uniqueness of the word and what it meant. Never could they have imagined 100 years later, if they were sitting around a table in our building, that we would have, for the first time ever, said, Washelli.com will be our first URL. And that came into fruition about 100 years after this happened. So they were they had a lot of great foresight. They were a creative company. They did a lot of really cool things, and I want to talk about a couple of the really instrumental things. So they built both the Columbarium, Rose Hills Moss, and then they built the Washelli Moss. But I really need to drive home how interesting and impressive this was, is that they built and designed the Columbarium, which would be predominantly all for cremated remains, and they were going to add a crematory to it. Now here's a perspective, a lens to look through that I think you might find interesting. In 1876, in Washington, Pennsylvania, was the first crematory and the first cremation to take place, 1876. A full 25 years later, in 1901, there would be 25 crematories across the entire United States, okay? So it's a fairly new thing, right? And then I take you forward 100 years from the time they started that first retort. 100 years later, in 1973, the cremation rate had only nudged up against 5% across the US. But in the next 46 years, across the entire United States, it would jump to over 50%. So they saw into the future. They were looking around corners we didn't know existed. They saw into the future and understood that the Pacific Northwest would lead the way with cremation into the future. And in 1920, when it was barely even a thing, they had built an entire building and a crematory. And of course, as we know, that had some pretty long legs on it. So they had also designed and built the back of Rose Hill Moss that you see there, and then also had built the Washelli columbarium. But at the same time, something else is afoot. Keep in mind how active that was. 1919, 1920, 1921, columbarium, mausoleum. They're rolling. And something else is afoot. Here comes the new kids on the block. So there was an area that was going to be a housing development. One gentleman pretty much owned most of that area. And there was a small group of Seattle businessmen that said, looks like a great place for a cemetery. Now, why? We don't know. But they were looking at that property and thought, that's pretty cool, we can do that. So in their articles of incorporation, which was driven by a few different people, one of those individuals we'll talk more about, but as you'll see at the bottom in Article 1, the name of this corporation shall be Evergreen Cemetery Company of Seattle. And that was the origin of Evergreen Cemetery that we're on now. So development would begin very quickly. A couple of shots of when they were starting to clear the land over on this side, and you'll find, I think this kind of fun to see, that is what we would call the old trunk highway, or the old trunk road, which would eventually become Aurora Avenue. This was all done in brick all the way up. At one point it had gone from south of us all the way up to Everett, pretty much all in brick. This is as they began to clear that entire section, and you'll see from this photo how many trees were in that area. This is some of the roadway and the clearing that they were doing. So they moved rather rapidly, and they had great vision. And one of the interesting parts about this, in a way, is that they had followed a principle that had came out just a few years earlier. And it was something new, and that was the term Memorial Park. Memorial Park was really a different view of a cemetery. The idea of the Memorial Park in 1917 came from a gentleman by the name of Hugh Eaton, who was kind of famous for Forest Lawn out in California, developing that and developing a whole new vision of what the cemetery would look like. They didn't want it to look like a marble graveyard or something with a lot of upright stones, so they developed it with all flat stones, rolling hills, and a lot of vegetation, trees, and growth. That was their vision of the future, to be the modern cemetery of the future. And that was the first burial that took place, and that was a gentleman by the name of Hugh Beckett, who was actually another Seattle businessman, and that he would be the first burial that would take place. And we believe that that photo is actually his funeral, and he's right up here. As a matter of fact, if you've walked the cemetery, you may have seen those, and that's right up on one where that burial took place. So tremendous amount of fortitude for them to do that. And what happened was, it only took a couple of years, and they realized, okay, this isn't going to work. Two cemeteries across the street from each other, one of us aren't going to make it. From what I understand, it was actually American Necropolis that first put the olive branch out to the Evergreen side that said, have you guys thought about? Evergreen ended up acquiring all of American Necropolis Holdings, and they purchased that. So now they had both Evergreen and the Washelli side tied up. So needless to say, the efficiencies in that will prove to be very, very strong over the years. I want to talk a little bit about C.S. Harley. C.S. Harley was one of those gentlemen that was involved in the incorporation of the Evergreen Cemetery side. He's very influential. He sat in both the House and the Senate in Seattle, or in the state of Washington, along with other organizations, and he was very active in business, and he really was a driving force behind a lot of it. I want to just mention David Daly, because David Daly was a gentleman that married into that family. David went on to become the president and CEO of Evergreen Washelli Memorial Park Company, and loved to run down that rabbit trail too, because he had so much influence, and he was kind of known as the Wizard of Washelli, but we're gonna stay on track a little bit just to bring you forward and kind of wrap it all together for you. So Harley was also a veteran, and it was a group of he and other veterans. He was Spanish-American War veteran that came together, and one of the great things that they did, they said, we need a place for our fellow veterans, brothers and sisters, that we need a special place. And they had looked to the east and said, man, Arlington's pretty cool. It is pretty cool. It's a special place. So they said, let's carve out a chunk of Washelli, and let's create Veterans Memorial Cemetery. And it was really a big part of that was having to do with Clinton Strong or C.S. Harley. This was a dedication. It was the first burial that would take place in Veterans Cemetery, and that was June 19th of 1927. John Hatfield had already been buried on the Evergreen side just back in May. This is in June. And they had wanted to make his placement the first placement over in Veterans Cemetery. He was actually disinterred from this side of the street. And in a full military cortege, they brought him, as you can see, the old original cemetery office there on the left. This is coming out of the gateway and then headed over to Washelli. And that's a picture of the military coming up through the roadway up into the original veterans section. That was the formal service itself with full military honors. It's pretty cool. That happened roughly at the same time frame, in the same time frame. That was the first government headstone that would be placed in Veterans Memorial Cemetery. So it was a big part of our history. At the same time, roughly that same time, how the veterans section or the Russian section came into being, that was also a group of veterans, and they wanted to have a place for their veterans to be. So that's why that piece of ground was carved out, and eventually they built the Russian chapel there. That came in 1928, and so it's right about that same time, and it was the idea of honoring their veterans as well. And then just a couple of dates of importance that I think kind of help bring us, again, we're hitting the wave tops of things, but bring us up to date. In 1973, they acquired the funeral home that sat over right where Verity Credit Union is at, and they began operating there out of that funeral home. And it became really clear that they were going to be successful. That was one of the early combination operations, meaning kind of that one-stop shopping. You can have your funeral home, you can have your cemetery. We're going to take care of everything. That was really early on in the game. And so that funeral home was wildly successful. It grew very, very fast. In 1994 is when Dave and Paul and the others came together and said, we really need a bigger facility, we need more infrastructure, and that's when they built the building that we're sitting in today. It was back in '94, they designed it and built that. It was in 2004, somewhat unexpectedly, that the death of Dave Daly occurred, and that obviously created a whirlwind of change for us because Dave had been at the helm for years. Paul was able to grab that helm and help guide us through the next days and weeks and months and even years ahead. And part of that came with the new ownership of Tim and Jay Brammer, the Brammer family. That's who we were acquired by. And quite frankly, it was a great experience. Paul built great relationships. We developed good friendships with them. And really, they did a great job. It was when they then decided to, or let me throw in there, in 2014, that's when we built a new facility there. Part of that went hand in hand with when we developed Cascade Memorial, and that came to life as well. And it was at that time growing very, very fast, so we needed the infrastructure. And then bringing us up to 2018 was when Tim and Jay said, we think we're finally ready to step aside from the funeral business. They've been in it for many, many years. And that's when we had the opportunity then to become partners with Dignity Memorial. So it's kind of a long way around the horn, but I wanted you to see a little bit about how we got here, and some of the shoulders that we're standing upon and looking down from. They carved that path, and so many of those little twisty roads that if they didn't happen, we wouldn't have the name, we wouldn't have the place. So it's just funny how history works in that fashion, and it brings us forward to today. I'm just going to give you a couple snippets here. Those are the cannons. That was the original shot when the cannons were dedicated. That was the 36-pound cannons off old Ironsides, off the USS Constitution. That's just the document that stated it. That was the original picture of the Russian Veteran Society of the World. Some you may know or may have heard stories, but if you were to go to the north end of Evergreen, that was all baseball fields. So these were some of the articles of the kids and the families playing baseball up on the north end. So 18, 20, all of that. That was all baseball fields back in the day. And then I just wanted to give you a little snippet of Thomas Burke that I thought might kind of find fun. We've got some of the original blueprints that are over there from the Burke Monument that you see there. And just as a little piece of trivia, 126 tons is what that monument weighs. Watson Squire, if you have the chance to see that monument, he had done 2 tours through the Civil War. He served with the Ohio Sharpshooters, and he was also the governor of the territory of Washington before we became a state. So we got some history there. And then this gentleman, Hiram Gale, he died at 104 years old and was the last Civil War veteran in the Pacific Northwest. And I love this story. So this is Dorothy Bullitt. Dorothy Bullitt, a couple of things. In her 40s, she lived through the Great Depression. She was devastated by the loss of her husband, her father, and her brother, all in 1 year. Then Dorothy went on to assume the role as manager in her family's real estate holdings, and she was very successful in her 40s, and in her 50s, she brought television to Seattle with King Broadcasting. She was the one responsible for bringing TV into Seattle. So we've got some really fun and interesting folks that are in our care. That's another picture of her. And then, of course, all of our Medal of Honor recipients. So that's a long way around the horn, but I hope that gives you just a little bit of our origin story to see where we tie back to. Any questions that maybe I can answer? Or... Yes, ma'am.
Does anybody, excuse me, know what's in the time capsule?
Well, kind of, sort of, yes. So that was done in '94. Some of the funeral directors and some of the other staff, and they were asked to write notes to the people in 2094 when they opened the time capsule. What do they want them to read? So we don't know what all's in there, but there's some of those letters and probably a few little mementos, probably some little Evergreen Washelli things. So yeah, in theory, it should be opened in 2094. I won't be opening that. I won't be participating in that event.
Did you participate in anything that went into it?
What's that?
Did you participate with the notes that went into it?
No, it was before I ever came.
Oh.
So, yeah, so I'm not sure. I just only read a little bit of the snippets of the story that they put a little committee together and then put some things in there. So it only goes back to '94. It was when the building was built.
Wayne and Phil were both here.
Yeah,
Oh.
both Wayne and Phil were here. Possibly, yeah, Thor.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Do you know who they
No? All right, well, thank you everyone for coming and taking time out of your day. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.